We're A-type personalities. We don't like to fail. We don't like to lose. We don't like to get it wrong. But being able to say, actually, I'm human and I might get it wrong, but I will always try to be better. Understanding that vulnerability is a really important leadership trait is something that I think is key to success.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced and executive leaders to build community, grow capability and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. One of the most pressing questions facing leaders today is this: how do we create workplaces where people feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically? For years, we've known how to manage broken arms, sprained ankles, trip hazards in the workplace. But what about burnout, anxiety, or the invisible pressure that weigh heavily on our teams? These are risks too, and they're often harder to see, harder to talk about, and harder to lead through. In this episode, we explore the evolving frontier of psychological and psychosocial safety. And let me tell you, the shift is profound. Where once the law reacted after the fact, when harm had already occurred, today it requires leaders to act proactively to prevent harm before it happens. This is not just a legal obligation, it is a leadership responsibility. To navigate this space, I'm joined by two exceptional voices from Gadens Lawyers, Haros and Deivina Peethamparam. George brings decades of expertise in governance and compliance, helping organisations understand the legal frameworks and the growing accountability of boards and executives. Deivina brings the human lens, the lived experiences, the cultural transformations, and the leadership qualities that build trust and belonging. Together, we cover ground that every leader needs to understand. George explains how courts are increasingly holding boards to account for psychosocial harm and why offering something as simple as an employee assistance program can now be seen as proof that you knew harm was possible. Deivina shares why emotional intelligence and vocabulary are the missing pieces for leaders, that it's no longer enough to just manage risks. We need to learn how to have conversations about feelings. We also talk about authenticity, vulnerability, and grace, why leaders don't need to be perfect, but they do need to be human, and empathy emerges again and again as a true superpower. From the rise of mediations and whistleblowing to the new frontier of reproductive health in the workplace, George and Deivina show us just how broad and complex this landscape has become. They also remind us what best practice looks like. When teams are humming, turnover is low, people care for one another, and success flows naturally from culture. This is an episode about the future of leadership, but more importantly, it's about the responsibility we hold today to create organisations where people feel genuinely safe, cared for, and able to thrive. Please enjoy this important conversation with George and Deivina. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. Joining me today is George and Deivina from Gadens Lawyers. And what we're talking about is what we see is probably the most urgent evolving topics in leadership today, which is psychological safety. Now, George, you bring a governance and compliance focus, and Deivina, you add the richness around the human-centered leadership and the cultural transformation and the lived experience. What I want to do, though, is I want to start with some of the basics. And George, I'm going to start with you because you talk about psychosocial safety and psychological safety. What is the difference between the two?
Well, that's a very good question, actually, Sadhna. And, this aspect is quite hard to differentiate between psychosocial and psychological safety. As lawyers, it's even harder for us to delineate, and we tend to treat the two as combined, and that is mental health and wellness issues really combined all in one. What we tend to think of is physical versus non-physical. And that's the way we treat them and combine these issues.
And in today's workplace, if you are a leader, I like the way you say physical and non-physical is the key difference.
It is for us, yes.
Can you maybe give me some examples from a workplace perspective around that?
Certainly. Well, the physical, usually easier to determine. Someone comes to work with an injured ankle or a broken hand or some type of injury, or in the workplace, trips over a box that's inadvertently lying around. They're quite easy to determine and see, and the injuries are easier to determine and see, and usually easier to diagnose by medical practitioners. Psychosocial or psychological or mental health issues, as we all know, are quite often not apparent. They're quite often not easily to identify. And similarly, the risks are not always readily apparent in front of managers and other members of staff. So you really have this distinction between what can be seen and easily determined versus what can be, underlying factors that might not readily be apparent to the business.
And the psychosocial piece is critical because WHS Act has expanded it to include the psychosocial hazards. Where are you seeing organisations fall short around this?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's important to say that the psychosocial and mental health aspects and ensuring the workplace is as reasonably as practicable, free of potential injuries, whether they be physical or psychological, have always really been embedded, well, for a long time in Australian law. But they've gained a lot of prevalence recently, particularly in Victoria, because Victoria is now adopting the uniform laws of the country. And so we're seeing more focus and attention on it. But it is the case that employers need to ensure that their workplaces are risk-free of physical and psychological injury to their employees. It's gaining a lot of traction at the moment. And I think with a lot of employment law, certainly as long as Deivina and I have been practicing for some 25 years, we've seen a real shift in the focus of laws in Australia. And it's moved from being very reactive. So someone is hurt at work or someone experiences sexual harassment or bullying or some type of injury in the workplace or detriment, and the employers react to it, as does the business, and you defend your position, to now being a real proactive area of law. So we've seen the changes to sexual harassment laws. Respect at work have incorporated those where you have to get on the front foot. You have to make sure your workplace is free of those type of potential harassment, sexual harassment, bullying. And that's what we're now seeing with psychosocial aspects, some real importance on clearing the way or paving the way for the workplace to be free of risk or harm to person's psychological health. And going back to your question, sorry, that took a minute, but going back to your question, where do we see a gap in the market? It's probably in the emotional intelligence aspect here.
With leaders and
as
boards.
Leaders, and probably a good segue for Deivina to comment on that.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, Deivina, like from your lived experience and lens, where do you see the gaps in businesses at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think leaders, there's a real difference between leaders and managers. And that old concept of managing people, I think people need to reimagine that to that concept of real leadership and emotional intelligence and the ability to have a conversation with the people that you work with about matters that do require a bit of emotional intelligence. We often talk about that real conflict or that real tension between HR and OH&S within an organisation, right? So when we're talking about psychosocial safety, you think of it as sitting within the purview of the WHS manager. And HR says, well, it's a safety issue. They know how to deal with risks and mitigate those risks. And WHS says, well, it's about feelings. We don't know how to talk about that, right? And it's really that combination of both. And I think what we're seeing is the real need for people leaders to step up and learn the vocabulary around having some of those conversations.
It can be a real minefield though, can't it? I mean, we talk about emotional intelligence, and it's something that you really have to work hard on from a leadership perspective, because not all of us have it. And then when you're talking particularly about psychosocial, things that you can't see could have an impact on trust. So how much do I trust this organization to understand how I actually feel? And I don't really trust the leaders to share how I'm feeling. How can leaders impact that scenario or situation in the most meaningful way?
I think it's a really iterative process. So it is about building those foundations within the team that you lead to say, we're creating a space for you that is safe. And you show that through your various activities and the language that you use around that. And I think for employees, they then learn to understand when it is safe to have those conversations, when it is safe to disclose a challenge that they're having. But it also requires leaders to always be on the lookout. We talk about back in the dirty days of manufacturing, and George and I have both worked in firms that have had a large manufacturing client base where the people leaders would walk the floor every morning, right? And that walking of the floor meant that you could spot risks and you eyeballed the people that you worked with. Now, it's becoming a bit more complex in the environment that we work with, which is more hybrid. So you're seeing, not necessarily seeing people in the flesh, but I think one of the most powerful things that a leader can do is connect, whether that is in person or, on screen, with the people that you're working with. And you do get a sense, I think, as you progress through your career, as that leadership muscle starts being exercised, you do get a sense for if people aren't doing okay. And one of the important things that we try to do with our clients is capacity build in the people leaders, give them the vocabulary to have those conversations. And I think more broadly as a society, we're better understanding how to have those difficult conversations. Are you okay, Day? Right? It's actually a simple question to ask someone. And if you've created that environment of trust where people know that they're held and that they're seen and that they're appreciated, they start feeling safe to have those conversations.
George, switching back to you, how are the courts interpreting the accountability around psychosocial harm? And are they starting to hold boards and C-suite leaders more accountable around it?
Yes, they are, is the simple answer.
Do you want to think about that one a little bit? No, yes, they are.
No, you don't want me to give you the lengthy legal answer. There's the hard and fast. We're seeing more and more cases where there's been a failure to protect the psychosocial safety of employees, filtering into the legal system. We're seeing cases where fairly innocuous activities of companies in the past, such as offering employee assistance programs to employees when they're under pressure, recently interpreted by a court to say, well, the fact that you offered EAP is a demonstration that you knew there might be some potential harm in your conduct, and therefore we are holding you liable as a result.
Really?
Yeah, really interesting decision. It was.
Does that set some sort of precedent then, George? Like that?
We're certainly conscious of it, but we try and think, what's the alternative there? Do you
just ignore it because that gets you the same result, right?
Ignore it, or do you perhaps add a sentence that says something along the lines of, we don't know what your current mental state is like, but if you are feeling stressed in any way, then perhaps you contact XYZ. So that's been a really interesting development, and we are seeing it creep into more and more litigation. And I suppose the interesting part is it's not as though there is, if you have experienced an injury, a psychological or psychosocial injury in the workplace, that there's a particular claim that you would bring. It could be contained in a whole raft of different claims, right from allegations of bullying to harassment and unfair dismissals. It could be a workers' compensation, of course. So there's a real myriad of claims that employees could bring that would encompass the injury they've sustained.
I just want to say there's no reason not to offer EAP. It's an important tool that, we need to be able to offer people in businesses. So just adding that in, post that little
that's right.
surprise there.
Your listeners don't just rip that out of their businesses. It is for a reason.
How do you see good boards handling these sorts of approach and situations? Because when you think about it, we've got financial committees, cyber risk committees, board risk committees. How are good boards handling this in their businesses?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a standing committee, a standing agenda item for boards to constantly come back and look at what they're doing, to collect data and analyze whether there's been issues, productivity, absenteeism, pointers that might identify some issues in this regard, but really make sure that you have it as an agenda item and that it's discussed and considered. That does a few things. Obviously, it assists, the type of matters that Davina's talking about, and ensure you've got a workplace that people want to be at and free from injury or risk. But it also, putting the strict legal hat on, provides some type of defence in the event that there is an injury in the workplace, and that the company can demonstrate that they've done or are conscious of their requirements, turn their mind to it, and the incident was a one-off, for example. And then, filtering that through largely your people and culture teams to ensure that you have policies in the workplace. And good employment lawyers, we always recommend policies as a starting position to dictate, what the company's expectations are in terms of day-to-day behaviour and conduct, and that there's training and ongoing training on those types of policies. And things that we are starting to roll out as a firm more and more commonly, things like bystander training, ensuring that your middle management in particular don't walk past an issue. And Davina and I have been involved with rolling out that type of training to a number of clients, and it's becoming more and more prevalent over the last 12 months. So there's some of the type of activities, it's both at that board level and then filtering through your management, ensuring your contracts, your policies, your training, everything is an ongoing and frequent training and onboarding of employees to demonstrate just what the requirements are, that if you see an issue that you need to alert the right people, and that if you see a potential risk or hazard, and these psychosocial risks can be what we have traditionally seen as a workplace considered to be potential risks, such as rise and peaks in the elevation of work, the manner in which people talk to each other and engage. These are now risks that companies need to be aware of and conscious of. And, it leads into things such as right to disconnect, when you contact people and how you contact them and the manner in which you contact them.
I want to actually talk about that with you, Davina, because the right to disconnect is a fairly new one. And I think we've all done it where we've, messaged or texted people who work with us after 5 or after 7 or after 8. You just do it. You don't want to leave it on your plate for the next morning, or it seems to be urgent. And then add to that, there seems to be this upcoming or growing fear from leaders around getting it wrong. So I might get a message from my employee. Now, 5 or 10 years ago, if somebody messaged me and said, it's a Monday and I'm not feeling really well and I won't be at work today, my initial thought would be, you had a big night or you had a big weekend, right? And you might text something like that, well, are you hungover or whatever that might look like. Now, that's a really, fairly basic example. But I think today, and I know that I'm in the same boat, that when I message an employee, I really have to consider what I'm putting in that message and how it is going to be perceived on the other side. So maybe talk to us about how we manage those sort of mental health conversations, not getting it wrong conversations, being authentic, but also being imperfect, because it kind of all works in together, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I love that concept of authenticity in leadership, right? And it probably goes to my view on this very question, which is that as a modern leader, you need to be a conscious leader. And that means always thinking about, as you say, how that message will be perceived, how it's going to land, but also having really open conversations with the people that you work with around your imperfections and that you might get it wrong. So that vulnerability in leadership. And also, when we're talking about psychosocial safety, a lot of the focus is put on employees reporting to the leaders, but there is that concept of psychosocial safety for the leaders themselves, right? So being able to say to your employees, I might get it wrong and I need some grace in what I'm doing. I'm not perfect. I'm learning on the job as well. And again, I think that is a two-way conversation as a leader with the people that you lead to say, I'll try my very best, but I might fall short sometimes. And I always talk about social capital, the deposits into the bank that you make with your employees or with your clients. You always do your best. And if people perceive that you are always doing your best, if you slip up, there's grace in that.
because you're not always going to get it right and you are going to slip up. We're all humans and we made out of this emotional, substance as
Exactly.
such called humanity and emotions. And we are going to get it wrong from time to time.
And I think the law understands that as well, right? They understand that people are not perfect, situations are not perfect. And if you can show a record of getting there most of the time, a slip up in most cases is forgivable. Now, obviously, yeah, it depends on the circumstances, obviously. But, when we're talking about these daily interactions, I think that grace does attach to it.
For people who are in particular marginalised, so they've been overlooked or they've been harmed in workplaces or come from a diverse background, what type of leadership do you think they're craving right now? And I'm going to filter that with a lot of the rhetoric that's coming in from overseas at the moment, which does concern me, particularly around the DEI conversations that are happening and at what point will it start impacting our businesses in Australia. But I think leadership can make a really strong stand around this and show the world how it can be done.
I agree. And, one of my pet topics is that concept of intersectionality, right? So we talk about diversity in a workplace, but do we then talk about what's layered on top of that diversity, right? So, I'm a woman of Asian background. I'm a woman. I am at the end of my reproductive years, right? So there's women's reproductive health, layered on top of it. I think probably one of the most powerful things that leaders can do is really see a person and, take away the context of the workplace. Most people want to be seen and acknowledged. And as a leader, if you are able to see the people that you work with in all of their fullness, in all of their wholeness, with all of their complexities. And if you are curious as a leader about the people that you work with, I think that gets you probably 70% of the way there.
In terms of empathy as a strategic asset, because some of what you're talking about, and, we're sort of filtering down back to that, is empathy is a real strategic asset for leaders, for boards, for CEOs, for founders, etc. What does that look like in practice? How have you seen that played out in practice?
Yeah, I would say empathy, to your point, empathy is a superpower as a leader, right? In practice, how does that play out? I think there's responsibility on both sides to grow that empathy and that understanding between people. So again, probably goes back to, one of the earlier things that I said, which is creating that environment where people feel safe to bring their whole person to the workplace. And that is part of the leader's job to say, I'm creating this environment that allows you to do that. But, one of the things that I'm deeply passionate about in the workplace is women's reproductive health, right? I think it's a conversation that lots of workplaces have shied away from. I think there are lots of tools available, and taking that example, I think there's a real lack of understanding about menopause in the workplace, right?
I was just going to bring that up. Yep.
Yeah. And one of the key tools that I think strengthens empathy that I've seen, and in fact, I'm trying to encourage organizations to take it up, is, I don't know if you've heard of it, Sadhana, it's the Menovest. It's a vest that you put on that simulates what a hot flush is like. And so it allows men in the workplace to put on this vest and feel what it feels like to, have a hot flush. And I've seen videos of men saying, how do you deal with this? And absolutely. So perhaps next time when I walk into a meeting room and I say, it's really hot in here, and George will have a giggle, it's really hot in here, can we turn up the air conditioning? And he says, well, it's freezing in here, right? There are lots of tools available. And I think as a society, we are equipping people with those tools, and that we have the technology to give people an experience of, those sorts of things. There's also a similar tool which simulates cramping for periods. Yeah. And so it goes from like 1 to 10, and a normal period cramp is something like an 8, right? And the men are doubled over, lying on the ground, screaming in pain at 2. So again, and being able to have a conversation in the workplace where you say the word period, or you say the word bleeding, or you say the word tampon, right, takes away some of that stigma, and it becomes like an easier conversation to have in the workplace.
I can see women running out and buying the vest for their husbands, leave alone bringing in the workplace for the men
Absolutely.
they work with. That's what
Absolutely.
I'd be starting first.
Yeah, I always say you can put on a jumper if you're cold. I can't strip off in a meeting room when it's hot, right?
Absolutely. Now, George, when When you get brought in to deal with workplace disputes and investigations, particularly around the psychosocial harm, what patterns are you seeing? And are there particular industries where there are certain patterns that you see? So, and I guess there would be the white collar environment versus the blue collar environment.
I think the expectation would be that I say that it's more prevalent in the blue collar environment, but that's not actually the case. You do see a lot of injury or risk to injury occurring in highly charged environments where there's pressure on sales, performance, where it occurs even in the white collar environment. What we're seeing is probably a shift towards situations where there's tension and conflict in the workplace in probably the first half of practicing as a lawyer. So, the first 12 and a half years of my career, there wasn't many effort in terms of mediating issues between employees. It was normally thought someone needs to leave or someone needs to shut up or someone needs to deal with so-and-so and move on. But particularly in the last few years, we've seen a lot of movement towards mediations in the employment space. So where you bring in a trained professional to talk about issues between people, which is slightly off when a claim is brought, but it usually starts with their tension between people in this psychological space. And we're seeing a lot more of that as a trend, this mediation aspect. We're seeing more and more investigations. So where people allege things and then there's a necessity to investigate a claim. And I think we'd have to say that there's more and more whistleblower complaints starting to eventuate in the workplace. And they have to be treated really carefully because there's some significant risk for businesses if they don't treat whistleblower complaints adequately, and they can eventually lead to criminal issues.
Have you seen a safe way in the industries that you work in for people to report? Because one of the crucial things here is whether I'm a whistleblower or someone from within the organisation, if I report something up to HR or there's an issue, as the victim, I have to actually be really open about who I am, whereas quite often the perpetrator can have a level of anonymity. Are you seeing, I don't know whether it's a piece of technology or reporting structures that protect the victim?
Look, we see the type of complaints raised come in all different shapes and sizes. So, for example, last week I had an anonymous letter left on a manager's desk with pages of issues that they had experienced from the owner of the business that they weren't comfortable sharing in any other way. Now, that's hard to investigate, and you have to reverse engineer to determine who it is. The one that we find most tricky is when an employee raises an issue with a manager or people and culture, and it's coupled with a comment, but I don't want you to do anything about it. Okay. And that is a really complex situation because going back to what the law says, the business needs to, as far as practicable, provide a safe workplace for its employees. Now, if there is a risk to health and safety, then there's an obligation to do something, but you risk getting the employee offside and feel like they don't have your trust or confidence to be able to deal with it. So they are quite varied how these claims come. But look, ordinarily, I think with most businesses, if it's raised, if a business has a policy, how the complaint's to be made, what's going to be done with it, then there's some confidence that it will be treated that way. And certainly, when we're advising clients, the first thing we say is if you do have a policy, that it needs to be followed rigidly to ensure that there can't be an allegation of breach of contract down the track. So I think, again, going back to it, policies are really important.
And are you seeing the use of enterprise agreements and other industrial instruments being used proactively to support this?
Look, not so much industrial instruments. It really does usually fall back to the policy. And if there's no policy, the culture and the custom and practice of the organisation is the way in which it's handled.
Deivina mentioned the rise of the AI and the hybrid workplace. How do you see that in terms of that being the next frontier around psychosocial risk? How can leaders future-proof the organisation from a completely legal standpoint?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting point. I think Deivina and I get some comfort from the fact that our jobs won't be made redundant because we have a level of emotional intelligence and being able to read between the lines that AI at the moment cannot do, although that's gaining on us quite quickly.
Well, it has no empathy. Like I've talked about this with other guests before. The AI actually has no empathy for the situation an individual may find themselves in.
has no empathy. And what we're talking about in terms of psychosocial risks and hazards and being mindful of them and considerate of them quite often is done by feeling. And for lawyers and even a lot of managers, that can be quite difficult to hone into. So I don't think this is the space where AI is going to be very easy to determine or to anticipate a risk. You really have to have your ear to the ground, your managers at the coalface, hearing and seeing what's happening. If you can see that someone's being excluded from lunches or being treated in a way that it's just those soft, gentle skills, or someone struggling, manner in which they're working or their appearance. It's a lot of soft skills here that are required for managers and lawyers to determine the risks. So I don't think it's something that you can necessarily put an AI procedure or some similar type of software in place. You have to really rely on your people and gut feel skills.
Question to both of you, and I'll go to you first, Deivina. What does best practice look like? So when you get it right in the workplace, so you've got the legal framework and the cultural practices, like, what does it look like?
I think what you see is a workplace or a team that is humming. And it's been interesting for George and I within our team, because I think as a leadership group, particularly in our team, we're relatively new to working with one another. And over the journey of the last 5 years, we have purposefully built the team that we always wanted to work in. And by lots of metrics, we're succeeding. We're seeing a happy team with low turnover, that are meeting their financial targets, that are really open, that care for one another. And a lot of that success, and when we talk about success, there are obviously lots of ways to measure that. But if we look at the financial success of our team, as lawyers, we don't ride our people in terms of the hours that they might be required to do, and yet financially we're very successful.
You do well. Yeah.
Exactly. So, it's been interesting, and I've been reflecting personally on, this is the stuff that we train clients on. This is the stuff that we get up in front of boards and we talk to them about the value in creating a positive work environment. And we say the success takes care of itself if you can do that. And I think we're living proof of that. It's, we can say it actually does work.
George, did you want to add to that?
Look, I think that's spot on. I'd only add to say that, it's the cultural piece. It's a genuine care for each other. It's a genuine care for the work you do. It's a genuine care for the clients. And when you bring that all together, you get an environment where you're really humming. And, Deivina's right. It's a point in time where we've got it right at the moment. We've got a fantastic team. And you just have to keep your finger on the pulse, because that can shift quite readily. So you have to really monitor it. But, culture is such an important part of organizations, and, that's when you're really doing really well.
And, organizations weren't built to be perfect, right? Because perfection doesn't exist. It's built to be messy. So we got to have people who disagree, who have, admit mistakes or make mistakes. You've got to have a level of discomfort. But in all of that messiness, it's got to be healthy. And I think that's the critical piece, isn't it? That's the bridge. Is we can have a messy business where we have discomfort, but it's all got to be done in a healthy way where our people thrive. I want to talk about CEOs and executive leaders. What kind of legacy can they leave behind? We're looking at future of workplace, and how we lead is changing rapidly every single day. I'll go to you first, George. What do you think is the type of legacy leaders can leave behind, particularly around the psychosocial safety aspect?
Whether or not it's leaving behind or during their tenure, I suppose it's creating an organisation that people want to be part of. And whether or not that's as an employee or as a client, I really think that's the most determining factor. People want to join you, people want to work for you, clients want them to represent you. I'm looking at it from a law firm angle, but it's that unification piece and wanting to be part of something special, I suppose, which is what I see as the greatest legacy a manager could leave.
Slightly different for you, Deivina. What do you wish more leaders understood early in their careers around this?
I think for me, the understanding that vulnerability can be a superpower as a leader, that it is okay to say to people, I might fail or I might get it wrong, but that I will learn and try to be better next time. I think again, coming from a professional perspective as a lawyer, we're A-type personalities. We don't like to fail. We don't like to lose. We don't like to get it wrong. But being able to say, actually, I'm human and I might get it wrong, but I will always try to be better. Understanding that vulnerability is a really important leadership trait is something that I think is key to success.
Question again for both of you. If you could design the psychological and psychosocial workplace of the future, what would be at its core? George, I'll go to you first.
I think I come back to the same point that it's care. It's genuine care. It's making sure that people in your organisation feel safe and comfortable and confident to do their job. And that comes about, if you care, then you are looking out for risks and identifying potential hazards for people.
Deivina?
Probably for me, it would be that concept of grace for other people's foibles and failures, but also grace for your own mistakes or shortcomings, and grace flowing both ways as well.
For leaders today, so whether you're leader, board, chair, CEO, whatever it looks like, George, what are some of the best things that leaders can do today to actually be completely across some of these things that we've been talking about?
I think it's communication. I think it's talking to a raft of different people in your organisations at different levels and getting a real feel for what's happening in the true workplace. Not what they're seeing at meetings that have been planned in advance, but speaking off the cuff to people and seeing how they're feeling, what they've got going on and what their concerns are or potential risks, and really having their ear to the ground.
Deivina?
I think it's probably building the vocabulary around having some of these conversations, so understanding and being able to hear what people are telling you, whether it's, explicit or implicit, but also building their vocabulary muscle in terms of having the difficult conversations. So I've got a client who rolled out some training. It was bystander training, and within that training there was the concept of the ick. And this concept of the ick has become vernacular in the workplace to say something feels off with this situation. I've got the ick about it. So it's a way to raise an issue without necessarily being able to say this is at the heart of it. The ick means something's wrong and I'm raising it because I think we need to do something. So whatever that vocabulary looks like, it need not be complex, because the ick is not necessarily a complex term, but building that vocabulary is really important.
I like that, because when you say ick, everybody gets it, right? Because
Exactly.
we've all felt ick about something at some point in our lives. And so you kind of get that feeling, you understand it. With the amount of change that's happening in the environment today, whether it's AI, hybrid workplace, how we lead, there's like, I could list a whole raft of things. Is there a new frontier for psychosocial and psychological safe workplaces that you perhaps are starting to see happen, but we haven't seen it in the workplace yet?
I think reproductive health in the workplace. I think it's starting to filter in. I think those conversations are starting to happen, but a real understanding of something
I'm just going to jump in there, Deivina. So when you talk about reproductive health in the workplace, is that women choosing to have babies much later on, maybe going through IVF, not having a partner but having a baby on their own? Are they the sort of things you're talking about?
Probably the whole reproductive health cycle. Right. So from, having babies through to menopause.
Yeah.
Right. If we think about it, reproductive health affects 50% of the population, likely 50% of your working population, depending on, what that looks like in your particular workplace. But its impacts on women's ability to show up in the workplace as required, or, as it is perceived it is required, I think is not well understood. And so I think that those conversations and that empathy piece that we were talking about really come into it, and how we can allow for women's reproductive health to be a conversation in the workplace, I think will really impact gender equity within workplaces.
I was just going to say, you've just added another layer to the gender equity conversation, which is interesting because we haven't really brought that into the mix before, and hopefully won't complicate it any further than it already has been complicated.
Indeed. And I mean, if we go back to, this concept of psychosocial safety in the workplace, and to George's earlier points, what we're seeing really is the legislature stepping in and saying, this is what a modern, diverse and equal workplace looks like. right? So, to account for each individual and what they bring to the workplace, you have psychosocial safety, you have flexible work practices, you have the right to disconnect, you have the positive duty. All of these things all dovetail. And what the law is saying to us is we are going to give you those boundaries for what a good modern workplace looks like. And if you follow those, arguably what you will create is that workplace that's humming.
Which is what we all want. Deivina and George, thank you for joining us today. And if people want to find out more, do they just contact Gadens through LinkedIn or through your website? What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Any of those means, you can find our details on our website and reach out.
Great. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you
Thanks
for
so
having us.
much.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast. And don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.